The wind carried dust across the dry plains like whispers from an old world, the kind that never forgets. In the middle of that wind stood a man, hat low, coat flapping, eyes fixed on the horizon. The town behind him was nothing but splintered wood and half-built dreams, yet for him it was everything he'd built with his 2 hands. Clay McAllister wasn't the kind of man who smiled much anymore. But years ago, when he was young and wild, he'd laughed so hard he'd fallen off his horse. The memory came back sharp, the day he first met the little Apache girl. But before that memory came the sound of hooves. He turned his head slightly. Riders were coming down the slope, a small band of Apaches, faces painted, moving slow but steady. Their silhouettes cut against the burning sunset. And at the front rode a woman, not a girl, a woman. And somehow, in one heartbeat, he knew who she was. He swallowed the dust and the years all at once. Well, he muttered under his breath, I'll be damned. 15 years earlier, the same man, younger, reckless, and all bones and laughter, had found himself chasing a runaway calf across the high ridge near the San Pedro River. He'd crossed into land he wasn't supposed to, the kind the army called hostile. He found the calf tangled in a dry thicket and cursing at it like a drunk preacher when a small voice startled him. You yell too loud. You scare Coyote. He turned, startled, and saw her, a tiny Apache girl, barefoot, a bow slung over her shoulder, watching him with wide brown eyes that didn't blink once. Well, I'll be. Clay had grinned. You huntin' coyotes out here, little brave? She said nothing at first, just tilted her head, studying him like he was the oddest thing she'd ever seen. Then, with the confidence of a queen in a child's body, she said, You talk too much. That made him laugh, one of those deep, easy laughs that echo off canyon walls. Maybe so, he said, tipping his hat. Tell you what, when you grow up, I'll marry you. That way you can tell me to shut up every day. Her little mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. You joke, she said, stepping back into the brush. Cowboy always joke. Maybe I do, maybe I don't, he called out after her. But she was already gone. He told that story for years, and to the hands, to strangers, to anyone who'd listen over whiskey. The little Apache girl, he'd say with a grin. Said she'd marry me when she grew up if I quit talking. They'd laugh, and he'd laugh too. But some nights alone under the open stars, he'd find himself wondering if she ever remembered. Now, standing by the edge of his ranch, Clay stared at the riders slowing down near his gate. The men stayed behind, but the woman dismounted. She moved like smoke, silent, graceful, controlled. The years had carved her face into something fierce and beautiful. Her hair was long and black as riverstone, tied with red cloth. The same eyes, though. Those brown eyes that didn't blink, didn't fear. She stopped a few feet from him. The wind tugged at her braid. You grew old, she said flatly. Clay managed a half-smile. You grew up. Something flickered in her eyes, not quite anger, not quite amusement. You remember your joke? Course I do, he said softly. Wasn't much of a joke to me. Her jaw tightened. You still talk too much? He chuckled low, but there was a weight between them now, not just years, but history. Behind her, the Apache men watched in silence, their faces unreadable. She stepped closer. My name is Nahima now, she said. Not the girl you remember. I reckon none of us are, he answered. But what brings you back here, Nahima? After all this time? Her eyes lingered on the ranch, the fences, the horses, the whitewashed house he'd built for a wife who never came. Her voice dropped low. You said once, you'd marry me. Clay blinked, unsure he'd heard right. And now? He asked carefully. Now, she said, my people need a friend, a place safe from war. You have land. You have power. And maybe, her gaze met his, unflinching, you still have a heart. The sunset burned behind her, painting the sky in blood and gold. Clay felt the weight of every decision he'd ever made pressing down like the desert heat. The smart thing would be to turn away. The town already whispered about anyone who dealt with the Apache. But the way she looked at him, steady, calm, waiting, it wasn't just an old memory anymore. It was a reckoning. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this was how everything would begin again. The wind carried her scent of smoke and sagebrush. And for the first time in 15 years, Clay McAllister realized the past had finally come home, and it wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, Clay woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices in the yard. When he stepped out onto the porch, the sight froze him in place. Half a dozen Apache men were gathered by his barn, their horses tied to the fence rail. Nahima stood among them, speaking low, calm, firm, the way only a leader does when every word could start or stop a war. He'd seen enough border skirmishes to know what this meant. The Apache weren't here for trade or talk. They were running from something. "Clay," called a voice from behind. Sheriff Rowe rode up the dirt road, 2 deputies trailing. He looked uneasy, sweat cutting pale lines through the dust on his face. "Heard you got company," the sheriff said, glancing toward the barn. "Word in town is a band of Chiricahua crossed the river last night. Folks are riled up." Clay squinted into the morning sun. "These ones ain't looking for trouble. Maybe not. But trouble's looking for them." He knew the sheriff was right. The army had been rounding up every Apache who wouldn't sign peace papers. Any white man caught helping them would be branded a traitor. Rowe leaned in his saddle. "I'll give you till sundown to clear him off your land. After that, I can't hold the boys back." Clay said nothing. The sheriff nodded grimly and rode off. Dust followed him down the trail like a warning. Inside the barn, Nahima stood near the horses, her men watching her every move. A boy lay on a pile of hay in the corner, feverish, breathing shallow. His arm was wrapped in blood-stained cloth. Clay crouched beside him. "What happened to him?" "Shot by soldiers," Nahima said. "They fired on our camp near the river. We ran." Clay peeled back the cloth and saw the wound, a clean through and through. "Bad infection, though. The smell told him that much. He'll die if you move him too soon," Clay muttered. "Then he stays," she said simply. He looked up at her, standing tall, eyes sharp, unbending. That same fire he'd seen in the girl years ago burned brighter now. "You understand what'll happen if I let you stay?" he said quietly. "The town already hates your people. The army's worse." Nahima met his gaze without blinking. "You joked once you'd marry me. A husband protects his own." Clay's breath caught, half in disbelief, half in something else. "That was a long time ago, Nahima. Things have changed." Her expression didn't soften. "Not for us. We still fight to live." He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You can stay the night," he said finally. "I'll get clean water and bandages. But come sunrise, we figure something else." For a long time, she said nothing. Then a quiet nod. "You still talk too much," she murmured. By noon, word had spread through the valley like wildfire. Neighbors rode out to see if it was true. Old man Wilkins spat in the dirt near Clay's porch. "You out of your damn mind, McAllister? Harboring redskins now?" "They ain't here to fight," Clay said evenly. "Don't matter. The army'll burn your place just for looking at 'em." Wilkins's son chimed in, face red from anger. "You lost your wife, your cattle, half your crew. Now you're throwing what's left away for savages?" Clay's jaw tightened. "Ain't your business, boy." "It'll be everyone's business when they come riding down from Fort Bowie," Wilkins snapped. "Don't say we didn't warn you." They rode off, leaving behind the sound of judgment in their dust. That night the air turned cold. Nahima sat by the dying fire in the barn, watching over the wounded boy. Clay entered quietly, carrying a basin of warm water. "He's fighting it," Clay said. "But fever's high." She didn't look up. "He's my brother's son." Something in her voice cracked, the smallest fracture in the stone. "I'll do what I can," Clay said gently. He cleaned the wound again, her hands steadying the boy's head. Their fingers brushed once, and in that small contact was something unspoken, a shared weariness, a buried memory of laughter on a sunlit ridge. When he finished, he leaned back on his heels. "You should know, the sheriff's given me till sundown tomorrow." She finally turned to him. "And what will you do?" Clay looked at her for a long moment, the firelight dancing across her face. Fierce, scarred, beautiful. "I don't rightly know," he said softly. "But I reckon I'll decide when the sun hits the hills." Outside, the coyotes howled. Inside, a cowboy and an Apache woman sat in the flicker of the same fire, enemies by law, bound by something older than words and by mourning. He knew that whichever choice he made, protect her people or protect himself, it would cost him everything. By dawn, the valley was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clay stood on the porch, hat low, eyes scanning the far ridge. The world looked peaceful enough, but he'd been in the West too long to trust peace that came easy. Then he heard it, a low rumble, faint at first, like thunder trapped behind the hills, hoofbeats, too many to be neighbors. He turned toward the barn. Nahima was already there, eyes narrowed, listening. The Apache men gripped their rifles tighter, their movements calm but sharp, like wolves sensing the hunt before it starts. "They're coming," she said. Clay didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The riders appeared an hour later, shimmering through the heat. Army blue, about 20 of them. A flag snapping in the wind. Captain Darnell led them, tall, proud, the kind of man who believed in order more than mercy. He reined up at the gate, dust swirling around his horse. "Morning, McAllister," he called. "Heard you're sheltering hostiles." Clay's stomach turned at the word. "Ain't no hostiles here, Captain. Just people looking to live." "Not your decision," Darnell said, eyes narrowing. "Orders from Tucson. All Chiricahua must be taken into custody. You know the penalty for aiding them?" Clay's hand twitched at his side, not quite reaching for the gun but thinking about it. "I know the penalty for forgetting we're human," he said quietly. The captain's face hardened. "That's a fine sermon, McAllister. But the law's plain." Behind him the soldiers shifted. Young men mostly, faces tense. One held a torch like he already knew how this would end. Nahima stepped out of the barn then, her shadow long across the yard. She carried no weapon, just the wounded boy's blanket in her hands. "You bring war to a house that gave us water," she said in English. Her voice carried across the dust, calm, level, dangerous in its restraint. The captain's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't even be speaking my language." She took one step forward. "Then learn mine. It means thank you." The words hit like a slap, not loud, not violent, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Clay moved between them, palms open. "Captain, she's right. They're not fighting anymore. The boy's hurt. Let me get him well, then they'll move on." Darnell's eyes flicked to the barn. "We'll take him now. You want to help him, you'll stay out of the way." Nahima's men tensed, shifting their stance. Fingers brushed triggers. The soldiers did the same. One twitch, one wrong breath, and the valley would drown in gunfire. Clay's heart thudded hard. He'd seen enough blood in the war to know it starts like this. Small, stupid, unstoppable. He stepped closer to Darnell. "You burn my land, you'll start a fight you can't finish. I'm asking you as a man, not as a soldier, to leave it be." Darnell studied him for a long moment, eyes cold as a church bell. "You've gone soft, McAllister. Used to think you had some spine." "I still do," Clay said. "It just don't bend toward hate." The captain's nostrils flared. "You've made your choice then." "Guess I have." Darnell turned to his men. "We'll make camp half a mile down. At first light, we take 'em." He didn't need to shout. The message was clear enough: surrender before sunrise, or the soldiers would come and take them by force. As the army rode off, dust rose behind them like smoke from a future fire. Nahima came to stand beside Clay. "They will come," she said. "I know. You could still walk away." He shook his head. "Ain't in me to run, not anymore." She looked at him a long time, longer than she should have. Then she said, soft as prayer, "You speak like a man who's already dead." "Maybe I am," he said with a faint smile. "Just waiting for the world to catch up." The rest of the day stretched slow and heavy. The Apache men sharpened blades, whispered prayers. Clay moved through the barn, setting out rifles, filling the water troughs, lighting one last cigarette before dusk. He found Nahima kneeling by the boy again, whispering in her tongue. The boy stirred weakly, fever breaking. "He's strong," Clay said. She nodded. "He will live. But if soldiers come, then we'll face them together." Her eyes lifted to his, searching, not for courage, but for truth. "You would fight the bluecoats for us?" "I'd fight the devil himself," Clay said. "If he came riding to take what's right." The wind picked up outside, carrying the sound of distant drums. Not Apache this time, but soldiers marking time, getting ready to move. Nahima closed her eyes. "Then may the spirits remember your name." Clay looked out toward the darkening ridge, where firelight began to glow in the distance. He whispered back, "They won't need to." By nightfall, the line was drawn. On one side, Lutwar and an army. On the other, a cowboy, a wounded boy, and the woman he'd once joked he'd marry. And as the stars came out over the silent plains, the first spark of war glimmered in their light. Night bled slowly into dawn, and with it came that heavy silence before violence, the kind that makes the earth hold its breath. Clay sat against the barn wall, rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept. The faint glow of the soldiers' campfire still flickered along the far ridge. Nahima's people lay scattered through the barn, resting with weapons close, ready for the first light. A low groan broke the quiet. The boy was awake. Nahima knelt beside him, whispering softly in Apache. Clay could only make out fragments, words that sounded like comfort and farewell in the same breath. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his legs, and walked to the open doorway. Morning light crawled up the sky like pale smoke. "You ever think," he said quietly, "that the world wasn't made for peace?" Nahima looked up at him. "Peace must be made. Like fire from stone, hard, slow." He nodded faintly. "Guess I never learned how." She rose, moving toward him, the faint scent of sage and earth following her. Her face was calm, but her eyes told the truth. Fear, sorrow, something like tenderness buried deep. "When I was a child," she said, "you laughed at me, said you'd marry me someday." Clay gave a tired half smile. "I remember." "I thought you were foolish," she said, voice steady. "But later, when soldiers came for us, I remembered your laugh. It sounded like a life that wasn't hunted." He turned, watching the sky turn pink above the far hills. "I ain't laughed like that in a long while." Nahima's gaze softened. "You can laugh again? When this ends." "When this ends, Nahima," he said quietly, "there might not be anyone left to laugh." The boy stirred again, coughing weakly. Clay went to him, dipped a cloth in water, pressed it to his lips. The child's hand reached up, trembling, and touched Clay's wrist. "Uncle," the boy whispered, his accent thick. Nahima's breath caught. "He calls you uncle," she said. "He thinks you are family." Clay didn't answer. He just kept the cloth steady, eyes on the boy's face. The child's skin was hot, his pulse faint, but he was fighting. "He's strong," Clay murmured. "Reminds me of someone." Nahima knelt beside them both. "He reminds me of what's worth saving." Outside, the first call of a crow broke the horizon. Clay looked up and saw the soldiers stirring, smoke rising from their camp. "Time's near," he said. Nahima followed his gaze. "Maybe words can stop them." "Words don't stop bullets, then maybe truth can." He looked at her sharply. "Truth?" She stepped closer. "If I go to them, if I tell them why we fled, what they did to our camp, maybe they listen." Clay's voice hardened. "They won't. Darnell's not the listening kind." "I must try," she said. He grabbed her arm, not roughly but firm. "You step out there alone, they'll hang you from your own shadow." Her eyes flared with quiet defiance. "And if I don't, your land will burn." Clay hesitated, torn between reason and something older, deeper. Then he said softly, "If you're going out there, I'm going with you." The sun broke over the ridge, throwing long light across the valley. The soldiers were mounted now, their lines straight as fence posts. Captain Darnell sat tall, pistol holstered but hand near it. Clay and Nahima walked out together, slow, deliberate. Her people stayed behind, watching through the slats of the barn. When they reached the open field, Darnell's horse pawed the ground. "This your answer, McAllister?" the captain called. "Standing with them?" Clay didn't move. "Ain't standing against you, Captain. Just standing for what's right." Nahima stepped forward. "My people ran because your men killed our women near the river. They said we broke a treaty, but there was no treaty to break. Only blood." Darnell's jaw tightened. "Lies." She pointed to the boy in the barn. "He is proof. A child, shot while fetching water. You call that justice?" The soldiers shifted uneasily. One young private glanced down, shame flickering across his face. Darnell's voice cracked like a whip. "That's enough!" Clay's hand went to his rifle. "Easy, Captain. No need for guns," Darnell glared. "You think this changes anything? You're still harboring enemies of the state." Nahima's eyes held his. "Then maybe the state is the enemy of peace." The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous, but true. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind rattled the dry grass, the horses shifted, and somewhere far off, thunder grumbled like a warning. Then the boy's weak cry echoed from the barn. "Nahima!" She turned, and in that instant something in Darnell's face faltered. Maybe it was the sound of a child's voice. Maybe it was the truth finally finding its mark. He lowered his gaze just for a heartbeat. Enough. Get your people gone by nightfall, he said roughly. If they're still here tomorrow, I won't stop the men. Nahima bowed her head once, not submission but respect. We'll be gone. The captain wheeled his horse and rode off without another word. His men followed, silent, leaving behind nothing but the whisper of hooves and the strange, fragile peace they'd almost destroyed. Clay turned to her. You did it. No, she said quietly. The boy did. His voice reminded them what they forgot. He looked at her, the fierce lines of her face, the quiet tremor in her hands. For the first time he realized how much courage could hide behind stillness. You saved us all, Nahima, he said. She shook her head. No, you saved yourself. And as the wind swept through the open field, carrying the last smoke of the soldiers' camp into the wide, forgiving sky, something between them finally softened. Not love, not peace, but something close enough to both. The sun set slow that evening, dragging its light across the prairie like a dying ember. Smoke curled from the chimney, the smell of sage and stew drifting through the cooling air. The boy slept soundly now, fever-broken. The world had quieted again, but Clay knew it was the kind of quiet that never lasted. He sat outside the barn, hat tipped low, rolling a cigarette that he never quite lit. The horizon stretched out endless, land that was his by paper, but never really his by right. Nahima came from the barn doorway, her braid catching the gold of the last light. She looked smaller somehow, not weaker, just human, tired in a way that only people who've survived too much can be. We leave tonight, she said softly. Clay nodded. I figured. The soldiers will come again. If we go now, maybe they forget. He smiled faintly. Soldiers don't forget, but maybe they get tired of remembering. She walked closer, the dirt crunching under her moccasins. You could come with us. He chuckled, low and tired. Don't think I'd fit too well. Cowboy in a camp of Apaches? You'd never get any peace. I talk too much, remember? A small smile ghosted across her lips. You learned to listen. He looked up at her then, really looked. The fire in her eyes was still there, but softer now, like it didn't have to fight the world every second just to exist. You're something else, Nahima, he said quietly. She tilted her head. And you are what I thought you were not, a man who remembers his word. They stood there a long time, saying nothing more. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the sound of crickets and the faint hum of the river far below. When the moon rose, Nahima's people prepared to leave. The boy was bundled gently onto a horse, his breathing steady. Clay helped tie the supplies, checking straps, tightening knots. It felt like the end of something he couldn't name. One of the older warriors approached him, nodding once. You are friend, he said in broken English. Apache, remember? Clay returned the nod. Just do me a favor, he said. Keep her safe. The man smiled faintly. She keeps all of us safe. Nahima mounted last. The horse shifted under her, restless, eager for the open land. She looked down at him. You will stay here? Alone? He shrugged. Been alone most my life. Guess I know how. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she reached down, slow, deliberate, and pressed her hand against his cheek. The gesture was light as wind, but it felt heavier than any goodbye. Cowboy, she whispered. When you said you would marry me, I laughed. Now I think, maybe you meant it. Clay swallowed hard, voice barely steady. Still do. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something deeper, old and sacred. Then the spirits already know. And with that, she turned her horse toward the open plains. He watched them disappear into the moonlight, a quiet procession moving through the silver grass, fading into the folds of the desert. The boy looked back once, raising a weak hand in farewell. Then they were gone. Clay stood there long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, the cool night wrapping around him like a blanket. The stars came out, sharp and clear, the way they only do in a land untouched by mercy or noise. He finally sat down on the porch step, pulled out the cigarette he'd never lit, and struck a match. The flame flickered against his face, catching the lines carved by years of loss and dust. He took one drag, exhaled slow, and smiled faintly to himself. You still talk too much, he whispered into the night, and for a moment, he swore he could hear her laughter drift back on the wind, soft and far but real. Years later, travelers passing through the San Pedro Valley would tell stories about the white rancher who kept to himself, the one who never remarried, who built water troughs out by the old trail where Apache riders sometimes stopped to drink. Some said he'd gone mad waiting for ghosts. Others said the Apaches left him gifts, feathers, beads, a carved token shaped like a woman's hand. But those who saw him near sunset, standing on that same porch with his hat low, would tell a different story. That every time the wind shifted east, his eyes followed it like a man waiting for someone he'd already met in another life. And when the coyotes cried on full moon nights, he'd lift his cup toward the horizon and whisper the same words, half prayer, half promise, till the wind brings her home again. The world never wrote their story in history books. The West buried too many like it. Too quiet, too complicated, too human. But in that valley, under those stars, for one brief moment in time, an outlawed people and a weary cowboy found something neither had ever truly known. Not peace, not forever. Just love, wild and wordless, carried on the wind.